Welcome.
So, as Mark mentioned, this began as a poem, and it's now become a book called You Are What You Read. And the reason that I called it this was to mirror the saying that we're all very familiar with, you are what you eat. So that's a very simple but effective summary that's made us increasingly aware that the way in which food is produced and the way it's consumed will affect our physical health. Missed a slide there. Good start. Well, information is to the mind what food is to the body. So the way it's produced and the way it's consumed will affect our physical health. Now, our information diet may seem less visible, but it's just as powerful, and it's just as important to our overall well-being. So with that, we have to ask, what kind of information are we putting in our minds? And what effect is this having on us? So I thought we'd begin by just testing how healthy our current state of mind is. So in psychology, having an accurate perception of reality is one of the key measurements for assessing someone's psychological health. So to test how accurate our perception of reality is, when you came in, there was a card on your seat which had a number 1 or a number 2 on. And on the back of that, there were some questions. And we've also given you a pen as well. And so if you could, just take 2 minutes to just fill out that questionnaire and see what you think the answers are to that. I'm beginning to see some heads raising again, so I'm assuming that you've finished it. This test was borrowed from an organization called Gapminder, and they're a fact-based organization that help not only test our perception, but also educate us about some key measurements of the world. And I'm not going to make you raise your hands or anything or pass your answers to each other to Mark, but I will share with you the answers. And it might surprise you to see how many people actually have incorrect beliefs about the condition of the world today. Essentially, they have an inaccurate perception of reality. So you can mark your own work with this one. So in the last 20 years, the proportion of the world's population living in extreme poverty, it's fallen by almost half. And it was only 15% of people in the UK who were surveyed by Gapminder who actually got this answer right. So if you did get this answer right, then well done. You are certainly in the minority. And as you will be if you get any of these other questions right as well. So there are 2 billion children in the world today, aged 0 to 15 years old. How many children will there be in the year 2100? Now this question trips people up because although we're all aware of the growing population, people are actually having less children than they used to. So the answer is still 2 billion. The increase or the rise in population is actually coming from an increased life expectancy because of much better health. How did the number of deaths per year from natural disasters change over the last 100 years? It recently decreased to less than half. There are 80% of 1-year-olds who have had some vaccinations against diseases, and again, it was only 15% of people who got this answer right. And worldwide, 30-year-old men have spent 10 years in school on average. How many years have women of the same age spent in school? And I think even if you did or didn't get this answer right, you can probably see where this one's going. So it was actually 9 years. And what's amazing about this test is it shows quite simply how wrong we often are about some big global trends. But most importantly, it shows us that the world may be better than we actually think. I found myself in a conversation with my mother-in-law, Eva, 2 years ago after I had my first child. And she said to me in such a disappointing tone that she worried about the future for my daughter and the world that she was going to have to grow up in because it's so much more dangerous than when she was young. Sorry to single you out, Eva. But you have to bear in mind as well when I share this with you that Eva was born into a world war in 1945, yet she believes that the world is a more dangerous place today. And she's not alone in this kind of thinking. An astonishing 71% of Britons believe that the world is getting worse. But actually, since 1945, and we're talking globally here, we're more prosperous, we have better health, better technology, better sanitation, higher IQs, less child mortality, less deaths from conflict, fewer homicides, and have seen a reduction in overall crime figures. And this isn't to say that everything has improved for everyone, everywhere, always. You know, as one of my favorite authors, Steven Pinker, said, that wouldn't be progress. That would be magic. And what he means by this is progress isn't linear. It doesn't just go up and up in one direction. And it's certainly not inevitable. You know, problems will always arise that will prevent and even reverse periods of progress. But if we look at the data over a long period of time, we can become aware of how things have significantly improved. So with all this progress, why is it that people think that the world is getting worse? And the answer really to this is, well, where do we get most of our information from? We get it from the news. And the news paints a really powerful and believable picture of the world that we live in. But as Mark alluded to earlier, the problem with this picture is it's distorted. And it's not an accurate reflection of the whole world. And because of this, we then don't have accurate beliefs about it. So we're going to just do the following exercise to just demonstrate this. So in a moment, I'm going to show you on the board a series of images, and you're going to have just 10 seconds to count and memorize the names of all of the green items on this board. So I'd like you to count how many green items there are and actually memorize what they are. Okay, and you have 10 seconds to do it. You ready? Go. Right. 10 seconds isn't actually that long. So if you could, just turn to the person next to you now and share with each other, again, how many items you counted and actually say what they were and see if you get the same answers. Okay, thank you for doing that. That's probably enough because there weren't... Thank you everyone for doing that. I think that's probably enough because there weren't that many green items on there. But now what I'd like you to do is turn back to that same person, and I'd like you to tell them how many red items were on that board. And I'd also like you to list what they were. Thank you everyone again. Thank you for doing that. So you may have actually picked up a few between you, but let's just have a look and see what they were. So starting from the right, going round, we had the balloon, the apple, the love heart on the bowl, the dress, the lines on the skittle, the shoes, the collar, the sleeve, the middle of the yo-yo, the hat, and the bag. And so, you know, this one was actually, even though there's a lot of red information on there, this one was much harder to answer because we weren't looking for it. You know, even though there's a whole picture of information on, we see most clearly the information that we've chosen to focus on. And we kind of ignore everything else. And that is exactly what happens with the news. So in the industry, they have a mantra, a very well-known mantra and fairly depressing one: if it bleeds, it leads. And this becomes their focus. So rather than reflecting on everything that goes on, the news reflects on mostly that which goes wrong. So the news reports on the most extreme stories of problems, wars, corruptions, murders, famines, and natural disasters, and it magnifies them, filling our television screens, our social media channels, and our newspapers. And this becomes all that we see, because at the same time it minimizes and often ignores stories of progress, peace building, development, and solutions, leaving us unaware of their existence. And the more we see something, the more common we believe it to be. And in psychology, this is known as the availability theory. So how available the information is. And similarly, the less we see something, the less common we consider it to be. So this overrepresentation of problems and this underrepresentation of solutions, it gives us the impression that the world is broken beyond repair and as if it's in a rapid state of decline. And it's important that we understand this because our focus becomes the filter through which we see the world, and it determines how we think about it. And adults aren't the only people who are affected by this. Children also develop this negative filter from the news. And they then use this filter to understand the world and make sense of its events. And we were shown this brilliantly on a Channel 4 program called The Secret Life of Six-Year-Olds, when a few of the children were acting out the evening news.
Hello! This is Rebecca. We're on Sky News. Stop it! I'm trying to eat over here. With me, Elvin, and Beatrice. Sorry, I'm just having a snack. Okay.
Oh, he's Sky News.
Yeah, this is a Sky News programme. So they're actually enacting how events are communicated in the adult world.
So, there was a train attack on a French train to Paris. They got the knife and got the gun and stabbed them. And they even killed the conductor. Yeah. Sad news, isn't it?
International terrorism is now becoming a theme of play among 6-year-olds.
I'm not sure I want to think about that.
No, but it does mean it's important to be talking to children about these things so they understand the significance of the event and the value that adults attach to them.
Because they know about it.
They know about it and they're talking about it with each other.
Yes.
Oh, have you seen that blow up in China? Yeah. Because that was on the news before on the telly. There was like a blow up in China. Yeah. Yeah, and like lots of people died. Next, plane attack in Surrey on the S21. They don't know why, but they're going to find out.
Although we can laugh, because they are quite funny, it is actually quite shocking to see how normal we find this kind of narrative to be. But why is it that these are the stories that have become the norm? Why is this the way that we see the world when there is actually a lot of good stuff going on? And there are two reasons for this. So firstly, because reporting on problems is incredibly valuable. By asking the challenging questions, highlighting failures, exposing corruptions, making us aware of problems and holding power to account, the news has helped us fight and correct injustice. It's kept people safe, and it's helped drive legislation that's ultimately improved society. And this is mainly because unless we're made aware of a problem, we're not in a position to be able to understand it, confront, and correct it. So it is a good thing. But the problem is we have too much of it. We have this huge imbalance, and where once it was helpful, it's now becoming harmful. And the main reason for this imbalance is because of a huge resistance from people both inside and outside of the news industry to acknowledge progress and success in society. And the reason that people can find it difficult is because it can be seen to undermine and ignore the ongoing suffering that still exists. And people worry that by reporting on progress, it will give us a false sense of security. But recognizing progress doesn't have to mean that we ignore problems. And nor does it mean these problems are solved. It's actually far from that. But we can recognize how a situation's improved and that a problem still exists and that there's still potentially a long way to go. And besides, without reporting on progress, we're given this false sense of insecurity. And that's what makes us believe that the world is worse than it actually is. And the reason that I bring all of this to your attention first is because how we think about the world will determine how we feel about it and how we behave within it. And there's a real link between these three things. So the next question to ask is, how does the news make us feel and behave? And before I share with you the common answers, or the most common answers from over a century's worth of research, I thought it would be really nice for you all to share your own experience. So if you could, just turn again to the person next to you, getting quite chatty now, and just share with each other how the news makes you feel. Okay, again, thank you. Sorry to cut you off if you're really getting into it. Sorry to cut you off if you're really beginning to uncover some things. But what I'll ask now, if you don't mind, just in one word, if you could just shout out maybe some of the things that came up for you, just so we can maybe, if you don't mind, just sharing them with everybody. Disengaged. Disengaged. Pessimism. Anxious. Frustrated. Guilty. Angry. There was a load there at once. Depressed. Bored. Addicted. Okay, great. So there's a lot there that comes up for us, and we may have found as well when people were shouting out things, we found some new things we felt about the news that we maybe didn't before. And it's interesting to take stock of how the news makes us feel. So to share with you my experience, I got to the point where I became so depressed about the state of the world and so disappointed in humanity from watching the news that I couldn't bear to hear another news story. And I say that quite literally, and I remember the exact moment mainly because it was quite embarrassing, but I was with some work colleagues and we were on our way to an event, and the radio came on with the news, and instinctively, like a child, I just put my hands over my ears because I couldn't bring myself to hear whatever it was they were about to tell me. And I think we can all agree that was a fairly extreme reaction in quite a professional setting. And I didn't always feel so strongly. You know, it was a gradual progression that moved me from being someone who watched the news daily to someone who could no longer stand it. But for now, let's look at some of the common responses to the negativity bias in the news. And as I mentioned, these aren't anecdotal. These come from a variety of research published in the last century. And just before I share these with you, it's also important to note that these aren't the effects of watching just one news story about one problem. It's the effects of the continuous and excessive reporting on problems over long periods of time without a balanced understanding of what's being done about them. So let's take a look at what these are. So it can make us feel anxious, pessimistic, and depressed. And these feelings linger even after we switch off from the news because we become so well rehearsed at feeling them. And we can think of it like making a mark on a piece of paper. So at first, that mark might be so faint that it's not that noticeable. But if we go over that mark again and again and again, even with the slightest of pressure, that mark becomes more defined and more permanent. And that helps explain why our feelings grow stronger and last for longer. So by watching only negative news, we're also marking a feeling of helplessness. We develop this defeatist attitude where we think that problems are just too big to solve. And that leads to a reduction in our helpful behavior. But our reduced efforts to help can also be explained because of an increase in feelings of contempt and hostility towards other people. So if we look at the headline in the Daily Express, like migrants take all new jobs in Britain. And if that doesn't annoy you enough, and it's a bit pixelated, but underneath it says, and they go to the front of the housing queue. Migrants take all, in capital red letters, new jobs in Britain, and they go to the front of the housing queue. Now, this is a wonderful example of terrible journalism. Not only because it's totally untrue, but because it's incredibly inflammatory and divisive. And you can see why headlines like this might make you feel resentful or even hateful towards other people or other groups of people in society. Fear is another common response that can make us withdrawn and unhelpful because it's an emotion that's generated to protect ourselves. And because we become so self-focused, we actually care less about other people and the problems that they may be facing. But we can also stop caring because we just become desensitized. We become so used to hearing about the extreme and the extraordinary that it actually becomes quite normal and ordinary. You know, we come to expect these stories of tragedy, crisis, and violence, and they lose their shock value. So rather than meeting these stories with outrage or concern, we kind of just shrug our shoulders and let them pass us by, often sometimes not even noticing. And finally, we can switch off from the news altogether. And this is where I got to. So having experienced most of these feelings myself, I felt like the news was no longer helping me connect and contribute to society. It was making me withdraw from it. And when I stopped watching the news, people labeled my decision. They labeled it as naive, weak, ignorant, shallow, and extreme. And this reaction that other people had towards me made me feel like I was damaged in some way. That there was something in me that wasn't strong enough or brave enough to see the world in all of its ugly existence. But I very quickly realized it wasn't me that was damaged. It was the news industry that was damaged. And this is when I realized that it's not about not watching the news, but it's about consuming it in a different way, in a more deliberate way, in a way that re-empowered me rather than disempowered me. And this is when I was fortunate enough to come across the concept of solutions journalism. So we are not talking about light-hearted, uplifting, entertaining puff pieces like cuddling kittens or water skiing squirrels. No, it's much grittier than that. The definition that we give to solutions journalism, or one of them, it's a growing field now, but that it's rigorous journalism that reports critically on tangible progress being made in order for us to understand how issues are being dealt with. So we still learn about the problem, but we also learn about how these problems are being resolved, what people are doing in response to them, what solutions are being put in place, and ask if they're working. And this isn't for the purpose of making us feel better. It's for the purpose of making us know better, by giving us this fuller picture of the world. And there are some powerful examples of solutions journalism happening at the moment, investigating some of the solutions to the biggest problems and challenges that we face. And I was really pleasantly surprised a couple of years ago when I actually thought it had gone mainstream, because I was listening to the BBC Inquiry podcast, and they did a whole program on what went right in 2016. And in this program, they included stories of a revolutionary peace-building initiative in Colombia, a controversial report on gene editing to preserve crops and potentially reduce starvation, a radical program to eliminate malaria in Sri Lanka, and a solar plane pioneer addressing climate change. And I mean, genuinely, I was truly amazed to see this kind of serious and robust approach to reporting solutions by the BBC. But I was very quickly reminded how on the fringe this kind of news is, because the woman who was introducing the show and presenting it, she began it by saying that good news had been buried under the bad news, and they were going to uncover it and gift it to us. Now, my issue with this is that solutions-focused news, it's not a gift. You know, this paints the picture as if it's some kind of luxury, and it's not. It's a necessity. You know, it's no more of a gift than any other news story we're given, in my opinion. It didn't stop there. They then went on to say they had selected 4 amazing stories united by one thing: the ambition of a small number of extraordinary people to achieve the seemingly impossible. And again, I didn't like this description because solutions aren't often the case that it's implemented by a small number of extraordinary people. You know, when we discuss these awesome acts of progress in this way, it's easy to think of them as miracles performed by superhumans to whom we could never match up to. And that's usually not the case. But if we're to understand this, we have to move away from the hero narrative and talk more about the process of change rather than the person who's actually instigating it. And we can think of it like a magic trick. So if we see the outcome, which is the solution in this case, it can seem incredibly impressive, maybe even impossible. But if you're let in on the process of the trick, rather than dazzled by the person performing it, it may not seem so impossible after all. So once you realize it was a group of 1,000 people rather than just one, or that it took 15 years to accomplish rather than happening overnight, then you may feel more empowered to act on problems in your own communities. And just to be clear, though, when I share this, I don't wish to sell these pioneers of progress short. You know, we can absolutely admire and be inspired by their courage, resourcefulness, and initiative. But we shouldn't talk about them as if their achievements are beyond what we could be capable of ourselves. So it's perhaps better to think of them as ordinary people who achieved extraordinary things. So what happens to us when we include this kind of news into our media diet? So to understand this, I created my own research to investigate the perceived effects of solutions journalism on both the readers and the writers of the news. And there's now much more research in the field at the moment to support these findings. But my participants said that it gives them balance and perspective and provides better context. And this balance has been useful in helping reduce anxiety, increase engagement, improve mood in the short term, and actually shift our mindset in the long term. And again, it's like marking a piece of paper. So these short-term feelings transform into something stronger and more permanent when we practice them more often. By reporting on solutions to problems, it also provides a restorative narrative. So it helps restore our faith in humanity. It improves social cohesion and it builds resilience. But most importantly, reporting on solutions can make us feel more empowered. And this is because it helps us develop 3 essential psychological ingredients: optimism, hope, and self-efficacy. So optimism and hope, they're both beliefs about the future. So they're the belief that the future can be better than the past. Not that it will be better, but that it can be better. Now, optimistic and hopeful people in this day and age can have a somewhat unfair reputation. They can be branded as cheerfully naive, almost like it was a friendly insult. As if, the only reason that we believe in a better future is because we're blissfully unaware of what's going on in the present. And they describe it like it's a flaw in an otherwise reasonable person. Freud, one of arguably the world's leading psychologists, or at least one of, said that optimists were in denial of reality. Optimists were in denial of reality. But actually, people who are optimistic have been shown to better engage with reality, especially a negative one. And this is because they exhibit approach tendencies. So they tend to move towards the problem. And in psychology, this is known as active coping. So being optimistic, it gives you the courage to both confront a problem and persevere if you don't solve it straight away. Pessimists, on the other hand, can seek more avoidance strategies. So they're the ones who are less likely to engage. Because they don't think the future can be better, they're less likely to try. let alone persevere if they stumble across a problem. And we can see that in this diagram here. So we begin by putting in effort to try and solve a problem. And if we succeed, then that's great, we can give up. But if we don't, then we evaluate what we think will happen if we try again. And if we're pessimistic, if we believe that the future can't be better, then we'll often give up. But if we believe that it can, then we'll put more effort in and we'll begin the process again, and we'll try and repeat this exercise until hopefully we succeed. So this kind of optimism and hope that we're talking about here, it's not, as Freud would suggest, a denial of reality, but it's a refusal to accept reality because of a belief that we can do better. And if we're to turn these feelings, these feelings of optimism and hope into action, then we need a third ingredient. And that third ingredient is self-efficacy, which is the belief that our actions are able to make a difference. And learning about solutions can actually give us that belief. So witnessing others overcome adversity and achieve progress in the presence of a problem can help us realize our own potential and give us the necessary belief to actually overcome challenges in our own lives and make a constructive difference. And a powerful example of this is what happened when Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile barrier. So before he broke this record, the idea of running a mile in under 4 minutes was considered not only dangerous, but impossible. But Bannister didn't limit himself to this way of thinking. Instead, he developed within himself an unwavering certainty that it was, in fact, possible, even though nobody before him had succeeded, so there was no evidence to suggest it was. But his belief to the contrary allowed him to train for years with focus and commitment. And on May 6, 1954, Bannister defied all of the conventional wisdom of his time, and he achieved the seemingly impossible. He ran a mile in under 4 minutes. But the most amazing thing about this story is what happened next, because it took just 24 days for somebody else to break this 4-minute mile barrier. And in the last 50 years, over 1,000 runners have gone on to achieve this success. And it's not that these successful runners had enhanced physical qualities from the runners who had tried and failed before them. They had enhanced psychological qualities. They had proof of the possible. So just to demonstrate how this works, and I'll be borrowing an exercise from Tony Robbins, what I'd like you to do at the start of this talk, you had on your place where you actually did your questionnaire, you had a number 1 or a 2 on the back. So if you could just pick back up your questionnaire and flip it to see which number you were. And can I just ask all of the number 1s to stand up? So number 2s, you're off the hook, you can stay seated. But all the number 1s, if you could, just stand up. Okay, and what we're going to do is you can put the paper down now because you'll need your hands. It's just to get, yeah, perfect, thank you. So now what I'd like you to do is just standing feet either close together or hip distance apart, just facing forward towards me, rooting them down to the floor, and just lift up your right arm so that you're pointing your index finger towards me, which is suddenly actually quite intimidating. And just outstretching it, looking over the fingertips. And now what I'd like you to do is just swing that arm behind you to where it naturally stops, keeping your feet facing forward. And just note, looking over that fingertip, noting, maybe marking a person or a space in the room, and just seeing where your hand is. And number 2s, so that you don't feel left out, can you find a number 1 to look at and just see where their hand is stopped? And then bringing your hand back to the front and just dropping it by your side. And now this time we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it in our imagination. So what I'd like you to do is just close your eyes. And number 2, close your eyes as well, so that everyone's in the same boat. And just really commit to this for the next minute. What I'd like you to do is just imagine lifting that right arm back in front of you. So don't actually do it, just imagine it. Just imagine feeling what that feels like, visualizing, looking over that fingertip. And this time, I want you to, in your imagination only, imagine that arm swinging twice as far as it went last time. And just seeing how that feels, maybe being playful with it. Feeling that right shoulder move back, that front shoulder move forward. And now imagine dropping the arm back down by your side. And we're going to do this once more in our imagination, but this time we're going to go 3 times as far. So imagine lifting that right arm out, fingertips pointing towards me, and imagine moving that arm now all the way around, 3 times past where you were, almost coming all the way back to point me. And just seeing how that feels, noticing where your hand is, feeling how it feels in the body, and again, being playful with it. And now, imagine dropping that hand by your side. And if everybody could just open their eyes now, this time we're going to do that exercise one more time, but we're going to do it for real. So if you can, just lift up that right arm again, and this time just swing round as far as you can possibly go. See if you can bring that hand all the way round to the front. And just notice how much further you've been able to go. Thank you. You can sit down now. You see, the great thing about this exercise is it shows that when we're able to expand our vision for what we think could be possible, we're able to push ourselves further. And what this shows us as well is that sometimes you need to see it to believe it. And if we're limited to these stories of problems and failures, it can be difficult to see beyond them. So we become trapped in this limited existence that's defined more by learning from what's not worked than from what has. And the problem with this is it's a very slow way to learn. You know, granted, it may provide invaluable lessons and it may fire us up to want to do things differently, but it's not the kind of information that unlocks our own sense of potential. So it's important to report on and learn from these courageous people who are finding methods to tackle problems and challenges that we face. You know, by learning from those who force progress into existence, we too become empowered to realize our own potential to be a powerful force for good in the world. And we do. One of my participants that I interviewed for my research, she said, by highlighting small but significant steps, it exposes the reader to possibility and can empower them to realize their own potential to make a difference. Another one said, the action taken may not be directly related to the content of the article, but I'm more inclined to roll up my sleeves and do something about something. Now, this is a very short summary of the impact that solutions journalism has on us. But even so, we can see that it's based on the idea that knowledge is better than ignorance. Balance is better than bias. To be included in and actively participate in our nation is better than being isolated from it. Social cohesion is better than division, and inspiration is an important part of development. Now, when I share these responses with you today, it may seem as if I'm saying that reading solutions-focused news is good for us and reading problems-focused news is bad for us. But it's not actually that simple. You know, as I mentioned before, having problems-focused news is a good thing. But we can have too much of a good thing. And we can see on this graph, so this was created by world-renowned psychologists Adam Grant and Barry Schwartz, and they explained the phenomenon of too much of a good thing using this inverted U-curve. So they said that just because something's good, it doesn't mean that its benefits are endless. So we can see that having some problems-focused news is a good thing. This is where it's helpful. This is, I can use this now. This is where it's helpful. But as we have too much of it, or we have more of it, the benefits start to reduce, they slow down. And when we have too much of it, the benefits actually start to reverse. And this is when it becomes harmful to society. And this is where we are now. And this is largely because the pace at which the news is churned out has increased enormously in the last 30 years. So what used to be only available in a daily print and potentially a radio program is now available on 24-hour news cycles, social media channels, and internet newspapers, with content being churned out by the minute. And most of it is negative. By comparison, solutions-driven stories, they're so absent from the news narrative that having more of them would bring about these benefits that we've spoken about today. But again, these benefits aren't limitless. You know, too much solutions-focused news, and we could begin to lose our sense of perspective and underestimate the potential risks that we face. Rather than being optimistic, we become wishful. Rather than being empowered, we can become pacified. And rather than being inspired by others, we actually begin to feel shameful about our own lack of personal contribution. So we're not saying that one is universally good and that one is universally bad, but it's so common to discuss them as if this were the case, and as if problems-focused and solutions-focused news are in competition with each other. But it's now that I sort of request and beg that we have to stop having this outdated debate between problems versus solutions. So rather than force them to compete to decide which is best, we have to allow them to coexist. And this will give us a much more balanced and accurate understanding of the world. And when I say balance, I'm not suggesting that we have a forced 50-50 split between problems-focused and solutions-focused news. I'm simply suggesting that we remain open enough and objective enough to see both the good and the bad and present them alongside each other in whichever ratio they naturally exist in the world. And one way to create this balance is to restructure the way in which we produce the news. And this is happening, but very slowly. You know, we could be waiting a long time for these stories of solutions to filter down to us because the industry still needs a lot of convincing. So a much quicker way to create this balance is to restructure the way that we consume the news. And we can begin introducing solutions journalism into our diet this very moment by reading from organizations like Positive News, The Correspondent, The Guardian Upside, Solutions Journalism, BBC World Hacks, and watching things like TED Talks to help us understand how these issues are being resolved. And this is just one of the many ways that we can change our media diet. So in my book, it gives you another 5 ways that you can change. And it really helps you understand why you should change. Understanding the why of anything is always the most powerful tool for creating behavioral change. So if you are inspired to begin a new media diet today, then you can pick up a copy at the back of this room at the end of this talk, and I'll be happy to sign any of them afterwards. But now that's the plugging done, we can just quickly come back. So whether you feel strongly that the news is too negative, but even if you don't, the news does have an impact on us, and it will affect the way that we view and in turn feel about the world, ourselves, and other people. So for this reason, it is important for us to understand the potential impact of the news and become more deliberate and conscious about the way we consume it to create a healthier media diet for ourselves. Now, it's much easier, perhaps, to become more conscious and be aware of our physical diet because it's a much more sensual experience. We taste and we smell food, and upon consumption, we immediately feel full. And not only that, we can see on the scales in a matter of days the consequence of eating too much of it. But our information diet is much less visible. We can't instantly see the effects of consumption on our mental health. And it's difficult to know what information is good for us in the long term when we're bombarded with so much information that appears to be beneficial for us in the short term. And this is where research is so helpful in creating links between cause and effect. So hopefully the links between cause and effect that I've shared with you today will stir enough desire in you to want to pursue a healthier media diet and reap the proven rewards of doing so. You know, once you make the decision to deliberately create a balanced media diet for yourself that includes solutions as well as problems, you'll experience for yourself the powerful shift in your opinions, beliefs, mood, and behaviors, as well as feel an increased sense of personal value. But we can't make this decision just once. We have to continuously decide to change the way in which we consume the news. Our decisions and our actions will make a difference every single day that we make them, and every single day that we don't. And finally, when making this change, be patient. You know, these rewards aren't necessarily immediately felt, so trust the process and take a longer-term view. But the sooner you start, the sooner you'll realize that the world is filled with incredible people doing incredible things. And it's up to us to find them, learn from them, be inspired by them. If we can find these stories that inspire us to create change, we can change more than just the media. We can also potentially change the world. Thank you.
Jodie, thank you so much. Let's take a seat. I'd love to open this out, obviously, for discussion. I'm really keen to hear some views and questions from the floor, but I'd like to also maybe take a moment to ask a couple of things. So I love, and I'm sure everyone here loves, this idea of a balanced media diet, of being, more aware of the good as well as the bad. I'd love to hear, if you wouldn't mind sharing, a bit more about your own personal habits around this. So you said, and I've done some similar things to try and change the way I consume the news, but you said obviously you've been looking at this for years and changing things. Could you give us a flavour of a typical day or week of consumption for you? So, I mean, do you watch BBC? Do you use news on the phone? Do you constantly get magazines and other things? What does it look like in practice?
Well, when you use social media, obviously, it's impossible to not pass across a lot of news stories. So I try not to sort of engage too much with things on social media. I prefer a slower journalism. So I personally don't think you need to tune into the news every day. I don't think you have to, hear about everything that's going on continuously. I actually think it's better when you read a slower form of journalism, maybe a weekly or monthly or even quarterly print, because it gives you a lot more context. And they've got time to really go into an issue in depth and help you understand it. Because I think complexity, where you've got this drive for simplicity with the news, whether the stories are getting shorter and then finding the hooks for social media, and you're shortening. And actually, I think if we really want to understand an issue, it's better to go in depth. And you find that slower journalism gives you that opportunity to do it, because you couldn't read those kind of stories every day. They're just too long.
So would you advocate maybe being more willing to pay for high-quality news content? Because actually one thing that was pointed out to me recently is a lot of the stuff we're seeing is sort of clickbaiting, was a phrase you used in that lovely video, but sort of it's almost trying to grab our attention because we're the product. We're if we're on the site reading the news, we'll also click on the ad, and it's almost intentionally shocking or whatever. Yeah. Is it worth us saying, well, actually, I'm going to subscribe to a trusted news source and a balanced thing and be willing to pay for that in this world of everything being free? Actually, it isn't free because I'm giving my personal data, I'm giving my attention to this. What do you think?
Yeah, that's in one of those 5 extra ways that I said about changing it. It is be prepared to pay for content, because the news, when it's done well, is incredibly valuable. But at the moment, there's a huge advertising budget behind the stories that are produced, and it compromises editorial as well. It's driven by different agendas. And actually, if we're able to pay for the content that we value, it actually gives them a lot more independence to report on stories that, you know, are driven by editorial rather than by advertising. So yeah, I think paying for content is a really good way to help sustain good quality journalism.
So you mentioned social media a minute ago, and one of the things I've sort of has come up for me a lot and has made me not sure how to respond to it is this idea of us all being in our own echo chambers.
Yes.
That we tend to see viewpoints of people that have a similar perspective to us, and that we have this sort of confirmation bias. So it's a bit like what you're saying, you see what you're looking for, but also, even in a positive way, you might go in a tunnel of, I only see this perspective. So I like to think, I want to consciously balance that by getting other people's perspectives. You hear people saying, people who are in the Remain camp should talk to people who are in the Leave camp and try and understand their perspective in the context of our current Brexit neuroses. But I find that when I do that, when I think I want a different perspective, I'm then quite often confronted with really quite hostile, toxic things. So what's that balance between wanting to be informed and get different viewpoints, but not then opening ourselves up to the hatred and the vitriol and the anger? Have you found a way through that?
I think it's a good step to go offline. So I do think, when you're in your own filter bubble, like you said, you kind of get your own opinions coming out at you. And it's, the way things are discussed online, and it's partly created because of the way they're framed in the media, is you have this very polarizing debate between people. And, again, in 280 characters or however many you have, you can't really afford to go deep into an issue. So I would recommend going offline, actually buying a print, because that will give you much more varied, it'll give you a lot more variety of information than you would get necessarily if you were just getting your information online. So I enjoy reading The Week, is one of my prints. I have Positive News, Delayed Gratification. Both of those are also slow journalism magazines.
And they're both here this evening as examples.
There are, yes, yeah, they're both here as well. And so I would, in order to kind of burst that filter bubble, you do kind of have to step outside of it. And there's also, BBC have just recently launched Crossing Divides, where they are kind of encouraging this debate between different viewpoints, but in a much more constructive way than perhaps you just get two extremes at one end and you can't really gain any kind of common ground between them. They're actually trying to create that common ground so we can bring ideas to their extremes, but also to their moderateness as well. But again, there's on my website, there's a starter pack. So if anybody was interested as well in, I'm really inspired, where do I now go from here? You can kind of use that as a tool to hopefully step outside what you're currently doing at the moment.
Right. Well, maybe we could send a link to everyone to that
in
the follow-up tomorrow.
Absolutely.
That's enough of me abusing my power on stage here. I'd love to hear some questions and feedback from the floor. So we've got microphones. If you'd like to wave your hand around, I can't see you all up particularly well, and we might not be able to get microphones upstairs. But let's start. I can see a hand up near the central aisle here, Fiona. Thank you. And then, and a lady with the microphone here. Yeah, please,
Hi.
over to you.
Hi. Thank you. That was great. It's really interesting, especially given where we are right now. It feels to me, though, that the bigger issue is more around the opinion-based news that we have. And actually, the headline that you gave there was an out-and-out lie. Yeah. And there is an awful lot of that goes on. And I get the fact that encouraging people with a carrot is useful, but also we have some legal stick in relation to the absolute lies that are told in some of these newspapers?
Yeah, I mean, that's holding the press account is difficult because of the lack of regulation they have. There's IPSO, but it's fairly ineffective at actually, holding account mistruths. And unless you've actually got the budget yourself to be able to go after a news story that's perhaps been falsely accused on yourself, then there are many victims of press that don't necessarily have a process of recourse when these lies are told. There are things happening in the industry now to try and at least put a warning sign. I think it's NewsGuard who partnered up with Microsoft recently, and they now have a rating on articles, on thousands of articles now, a star rating that actually gives you an idea. I think the Daily Mail got 1 out of 5. But it gives you an idea of how trustworthy these sources are. So there's a kind of growing fact-based checking system that's trying to help us to develop a kind of media literacy, to know what we should be paying attention to and what we shouldn't. But it's certainly a problem. And this is why I do think, actually, the people who really have the power to hold the media to account are consumers, because the only reason they're peddling these lies and driving these very sensationalized stories is to grab our attention. And so if we can equip ourselves with the knowledge to move from being consumers to becoming conscious consumers, and we can push past our immediate desire to just follow it is whatever's grabbed our attention, and we engage with a kind of journalism that is constructive and that is well researched, then there will become more of that, because ultimately the news is a profit-seeking organization. And so if we create a different demand, they will be forced to give us a different supply.
Great response to a very good question. I totally agree with the point, and I think the worrying thing about the lying headlines is, of course, when the apology is then published, it's on page 7 or on page 1, and you get this huge imbalance. Thank you for that. And I think there was another question near the aisle here. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you. I saw something online when you were at a conference with the news presenter Martin Lewis.
Yes.
And I was interested that he said that he'd been looking into this negative coverage for 25 years. Can you tell me, presumably in your research, you've spoken to journalists and editors and the media in general, how receptive are they to make a change?
Do you know, it's an interesting question, and it's definitely one that's, my answer's changed than it was 10 years ago. I started this 10 years ago, and it was actually a fairly hostile, I mean, this is definitely the nicest crowd I think I've spoken in front of. I've spoken in front of some incredibly hostile audiences, mainly journalists, at the start, you know, when this was 10 years ago. And the reason for the hostility was predominantly because they misunderstood the concept. You know, solutions journalism has had a very fluffy reputation that's been an and finally at the end of the news, and people dismissed it. But now, with this growing field of solutions journalism, where you have organizations practicing it brilliantly and seriously, news organizations are beginning to get quite curious, and they're actually beginning to see the value in reporting it, and not just for readership, but actually to fulfill their journalistic principles. You know, holding power to account is one of the cornerstones for journalism. And when you have, you know, when you're reporting problems, that's fine, you're bringing it to the attention of us to hopefully address it. But when you see solutions, when you report on solutions, it can actually increase accountability, because when we don't think a problem can be solved, there won't necessarily be the resources going into it, and people can dismiss it as if it's a kind of timeless problem. But when you see people, you know, like malaria in Sri Lanka, the radical steps that they took to eliminate it, it then puts pressure on people facing similar problems in their community. It puts pressure on government, businesses, organizations, and even individuals to do something about it. So it's beginning to be embraced by news organizations, not least of all because people do want it, but because it actually fulfills what they're there to do as well. And so they're recognizing the credibility in it.
Just add one thing.
Yeah, of course.
I'm a journalist, and we're not all hostile, and a lot of us are very receptive. That's why we're here.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's great to see it growing, and the more of you we get on board, the better.
Thank you for that. Let's come down and take this question down at the front on the left here, and then we'll go over to this side of the room afterwards. Thanks.
Hi, I'm a journalist. I'm a journalist, a programme maker, and I run a radio station. And first of all, just thank you for what you're doing. I think it's fantastic, and I am open to learning about change. I think it's a really interesting position that you're taking, which is an important one, which is change consumer behaviour, and that will influence what's being delivered. And I think the thing that spoke to me quite significantly was the sort of it's not a competition between problem-focused and solution-focused journalism, and it's not. I think you referred to sort of good stories and bad stories, or positive stories and negative stories. For me, it's about. I don't think we're going to. I think the newsrooms are going to report what they consider to be the news. It's about how they report that, which is important for me. So, yes, report the same stories, but don't just say, this bad thing happened. Say this bad thing happened, but then this is what's being done to make the bad thing less bad. And use the journalism and use the rigour to analyse that side of things, not just telling us, here are the facts and here's the terrible thing, but this is how it can be made better, and this is what people are doing, and not the fluff, not the and finally. Yeah. Some of them are doing it very badly, and here's why, or some of them are doing it very well, and here's why. For me, that's the really important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that that's definitely, you know, and you've got to remember, solutions don't exist in isolation. You know, they're not just altruistic acts of kindness that people do. They're very much attached to a problem. They're people usually who are most connected to the problem that are finding solutions to tackle it. And so again, it's, and this is where I do really value slow journalism, and it can be brought into a much faster paced practice when you've sort of got long form journalism, but to have that kind of narrative of, you know, here's the news, here's why it's bad, this is what's being done about it, and you know, that might not necessarily be working, but it's giving you an indication of what's happening next. You do need a longer time frame on that than just breaking news. And this is where I think actually, where the media landscape's changed, and you have social media, journalists aren't necessarily the ones who are breaking the news anymore. And in that case, you have an incredibly valuable role to provide context and verification and help us make sense of all this information that's flying around. And so I agree with you completely. You know, if you can harness all of that information into something really informative and sort of give us the backstory, the present, and the next part, I think that would be incredibly helpful. So yeah, thank you.
And I think just to add something to that, I think is it the state broadcaster in Denmark have adopted this as the way that they do news, and it's transformed their relationship with their audiences. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, Denmark are definitely leading the way in constructive journalism. They have a lot of organisations out there who are doing it and doing it very well. The Constructive Institute, they hold a constructive journalism conference every year, and it brings together the best practices, and you know, we can all learn from each other, and it's, if you are interested as a journalist in the audience of learning more about it, it's definitely a good conference to attend.
And of course, Denmark consistently tops the World Happiness rankings or thereabouts as well, so there may be some correlation there. Lovely to hear from two constructively focused journalists as well. That's great. Let's go to the back over here. Fiona, could you choose someone with a hand up? Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for this talk. I'm also a journalist, sorry about this.
They're everywhere.
There's no
nice
conspiracy.
To see so many of you here.
I think it's very interesting. 2 points though. I think the way you talk about how people consume news and everything like this, it's interesting, but it also feels like people are very passive when actually you could not be passive. And you talk about slow journalism or constructive journalism, but to me, it's just journalism. It just depends, I guess, on where you decide to get your information from. And the example you took tonight about the Daily Express, I hope there's no Daily Express journalists in the room, but I don't think it's the most, you know, some people buy the Daily Express to have a certain type of news as well. It's not like other national newspaper, I think. So at a time where journalists and the media is very criticized, I think it might be a bit dangerous to say that it's all about bad news and bad journalism, because it's also on people's responsibility, readers, viewers, auditors, to choose where they get their information from. And the second point is, you said later that there is a news agenda and some newspapers are biased and everything. And I'm a freelancer, so that means I work from my kitchen in my little flat in Finsbury Park. There's nobody who is coming and tapping on my shoulder to tell me this is the way you should write your article. So I think there is a lack of knowledge about journalism in general, and I think maybe that it would be good to have some of education for people on how journalists work, how the industry works. So yeah, I just wish that was a little bit more balanced on the bad news, good news, because you know it's a very complicated industry, and I think if people aware of where they choose to get their information from, that would make a difference, which is kind of what you say at the end. But
No, absolutely. No, I completely agree with you. And the kind of talk that I shared with you today, because I wanted to give you something practical to be able to take away. So it came mainly from my last 2 chapters of the book, which is the power to change and what you can do about it. But the rest of the book is all about media literacy. So it's actually telling people, how the news is produced, helping people kind of understand, because as a consumer myself, I'm not a journalist, I'm a consumer, so I've always come at it from that way. But I think it's really important that as consumers, we understand the kind of manufacturing process behind how stories reach us. And I'm not cynical of news. I think the news is an incredibly valuable institution that we need in society, but I think it's not performing at its best. And so my work is trying to, because the industry is always looking to improve itself and think about ways in which they can, reach wider audiences or how they can tell stories. But actually, I think they're leaving a really important player out of that conversation, which is the consumer. So having done all of this work in this space for the last 10 years, my now next step is to invite consumers to become a part of this media revolution and recognize that they are also part of the problem and they can be part of the solution. And so it's hopefully kind of giving everything that you were just saying airtime and actually helping us understand it better.
Jodie, one thing that I've been really inspired by as a public shift in attitude, but I think the media to some extent has played a really helpful role here, is around our conversation on mental health. So obviously, as you'd imagine with Action for Happiness, we're hugely passionate about improving the nation's sort of mental well-being, and everyone in the audience, I think, would have seen how much more conversation there is about mental health. In a really, obviously the media's played a role in saying there's a mental health issue, but there's also been much more willingness to share the stories and the people being able to talk about their experiences in really open ways where they don't get shot down for it. So I think it's an example of an area where there's been huge progress in the way things are reported. But I was also struck in your video again about the media, likes to point the finger at others, but doesn't turn in on itself particularly. Lovely to hear much more self-aware journalists in the room here. But do you think we'll see, I kind of hope we'll see over the next decade, the media starting to recognise its own impact on the mental health of the nation? Because a lot of anxiety generation, we have all these huge problems around people dealing with anxiety in particular, and you can't help but imagine that the media is not helping there in the broadest sense. Do you think there'll be an increasing awareness that the media has a role not just to communicate what's going on, but to be conscious of the impact it has on the psychology of people? Is that starting to emerge? I
think it's the driving force behind some of these niche sort of, I say niche, they've got an enormous customer base, but I suppose they're not really on the mainstream agenda at the moment. But yeah, absolutely. I think people do care about the kind of quality of content that they produce and the effect that it has on their readers. Having that kind of social responsibility. There was a journalist called Lara she's created an organization called News Deeply, which is kind of this slow journalism that helps you understand, they deep dive into issues. And she does that really with the aim. She says at the beginning that journalists should take a Hippocratic oath not to do harm. And so it's kind of being aware that you have a product to sell, but in any other industry that you also take into account the cost of the externalities. And so you weigh out how your work actually affects the community in which you're, if you're a profit organization, how your work actually impacts the wider community, and build those things in as a cost. And I think that the psychological impact that the news does have on us will hopefully be embraced as a cost.
So let's do this little test here. So are there any journalists in the room who'd be willing to take a Hippocratic style oath to say, try to do no harm through my reporting? Okay, good. Excellent. We're making progress. That's great. We've got time for just a few more questions before we wrap up, and there's a few things we want to say at the end. So let's come. Actually, I haven't taken any from upstairs. Are there any hands up upstairs? I'm afraid I can't really see upstairs. Can't see any currently. So let's come to this lady down in the middle here, and then we'll go to the gentleman over on the right-hand side over there, Adam, afterwards. Thank you. Sorry, Fiona, just this lady here in the middle. Can we? Yes, thank you. There we go. You did have your hand up, didn't you?
I did.
Yes.
I did,
over to you.
Do you think that solutions-based journalism is inherently left-wing? Is it, you know, because there's so much media bias in this country. I'm an immigrant to this, and, you know, I used to read all the papers trying to work out which one of them was left, right, something my dad would have read, etc. So do you think it's inherently a left-wing progressive cause?
It's interesting, actually. I went to a talk last week at a new news organisation called Tortoise, and this was their exact question: is the news too left-wing? And it really depends who you speak to who will give you that answer. I mean, there are certainly organisations that are left-wing. The BBC is probably, you know, as a public broadcasting house that we all subscribe to, is left-wing. But when you look at the readership figures of the most read newspapers in the UK, which off the top of my head, I know the Daily Mail, I think the Daily Express, the Telegraph, the ones who actually have the biggest readership are actually right-wing. So although there may be left-wing publications, and even if there are more left-wing publications, I'm not really sure on the statistics of how many are to which side, the most read newspapers definitely have a right-wing bias.
But I think the question was more about in terms of supporting this agenda of constructive journalism.
I think is solutions-based journalism, do you think it's inherently
does it get more support from the left of centre rather than the right?
Can you do this and be right-wing?
Do you mean as a consumer or as a publication out of interest?
I think the publication leads the politics.
Okay. Yeah. I don't see why not. You know, it's reporting on a truth. It's not, you know, I think it's a very inclusive truth when you're reporting on solutions and how things are being done and how things are being done well. I think we can always learn from that, regardless of the political leaning of left and right. As I'm not a journalist myself, I wouldn't necessarily like to overplay my hand, and so I couldn't necessarily give you an honest answer to that.
I would hazard a guess, actually, that it's not particularly biased. It's interesting in the well-being world that we focus on with Action for Happiness. We see the different sides of the political spectrum in the publications world having a different focus. So the right-of-centre publications are really more supportive or like to do stories on how individuals can look after their own mental well-being, whereas the left-of-centre will want to do stories on why the government should do more to care for people who are struggling with issues. Of course, both angles are important in different ways. And in some respects, the bad news stories I see almost as prevalent left of centre as right of centre. So I don't think there's necessarily that bias in what you might consider solutions focused. And then there was a gentleman over here, and then we're going to be rapidly running out of time, I think. So, I mean, just on that last point, you mentioned The Week, and I think The Week is an example of a publication that will share something from the Telegraph, something from the Guardian, something from the Mail, and give a bit of that balance. So maybe that's a nice example.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially as you were saying, you know, if you're trying to read all of the newspapers to try and get that balance, you're probably not going to get it. I think the Washington Post it publishes 500 articles a day, and that's just one news organisation. So for us to kind of take that burden on ourselves, I don't think we'll do much anything else in life. So I prefer reading from magazines that kind of curate that for us. So The Week is always quite a good one for me.
Gentleman over here, over to you.
Hi, Jodie. Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned the word curation, and that's kind of really what I want to talk about. Is we've talked about content creation. The way that I consume news, and the way that a lot of people consume news, I don't buy a newspaper. I don't just watch one channel. And previously, 20 years ago, if I bought The Guardian or The Sun or The Mirror or whatever, I'd have a selection of stories there. Whether I read them or not is my choice, but I've paid for that one title. Now, I go into Google. It knows what I want. It's self-selecting in many ways. There are sports stories I don't care about. Brexit, I do. So what's happening now, I get delivered stuff that's just reinforcing and what I want to hear. And the thing that I'd kind of like to get your take on is, you talk a lot about print. I consume a lot of news online via YouTube, via other news apps. On YouTube recently, I started looking at political videos just to be more self-aware. Within days, I'm delivered just an avalanche of the stuff to keep me on the site. Now, the reason for that is they want me to stay on the site. So the advertising model is very different to how it was. An advertiser won't know what they're appearing next to. That's very much based on me. So I started to look at kind of what's the other side? What's the other side to my view saying, I've now been delivered the most horrific stuff in my YouTube feed, very extremist stuff, right? You know, but it's making me angry, and it's like I have to take a step back, and it goes back to curation. So it's illusion of curation, but actually the algorithms for Facebook, for Twitter as well, it's a really
sorry, you're
toxic
saying
place.
you consciously changed what you were looking for, and then you suddenly found a whole new
I knew what was happening. I knew that it was delivering me stuff that I wanted to know about. I wanted to get a different perspective. So I chose what you were saying, see what the other side's saying. I'm now being delivered stuff that's just fueling this echo chamber, but the self-selection illusion is no longer there. I'm being delivered stuff, not because it's interesting to me, because it's going to really make me watch the video for 10 minutes, then 20 minutes. And before I know it, I've lost the whole evening watching horrible news, and I'm definitely going to buy your book because I need a diet, definitely. But it's the model is changing, and so it's not about journalists or news creators creating a balanced story. It's about me being fed, not by one publication, by a stream. In my newsfeed, I get stuff from the Mail and the Guardian. I have to then deselect. I don't want to read the Mail articles, but I have to do that.
There's actually a really good app that can save you a lot of time, and it's called Perspex. And what it does is it takes an issue and it presents it from 3 sides. So it will take, maybe the indicative votes in Parliament, or whatever issue that's current at the time, and it will give you the most neutral argument for it that's fairly unemotional, presented on facts, and then it will give you the left-wing view and the right-wing view. So it will give you 3 stories for every 1 story, and it will help you create for yourself the kind of spectrum of conversation. And that's really useful in again, bursting our filter bubble and actually seeing what other people are saying, or taking another view from the position that we sit in. And it will save a lot of time of actually having to find it ourselves.
That's a great tip. Thank you so much. I'd love to just end, before we just finally wrap up, with a little bit of a sense of what people do in the room. So who here watches television news on a sort of regular, daily basis, just to get a sense? So a good proportion, so over half of us still do that. Okay. Who here would subscribe, actually get a sort of daily or regular newspaper publication in the conventional sense? So fewer, maybe more like a third. Who sees news, let's say daily, to some extent online, on a phone, on a screen in some way? That's the highest of the percentage. That's more like 2/3. Yeah, does that sound consistent with what you see elsewhere? Do you think that's how we're shifting?
Yeah, I mean, we spend a lot of time online. And again, where we are spending an increasingly amount of time online, our mental well-being has actually never been more important than it is now. We have this kind of virtual existence where we live enormously in our minds. And that's why now, more than ever, it's important to be aware of the impact that it has on us. And as I said, make these deliberate choices to not just instinctively read the way in which we're necessarily impulsed to do, and in a way that's given to us, but kind of step outside of this ease and take a perhaps less convenient route at times, with a longer term view to actually have a much, much more beneficial relationship with it.
Yes. So there's a couple of things I want to say right at the end, but right now I just wanted to I invite you to join me in saying a huge thank you to Jodie for this evening. It's been fantastic.